So during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, inland waterways throughout northeastern North America served as kind of highways that offered vital access to the early northern colonies. These highways were the stage for many conflicts among native and foreign powers. It was in the mid-1750s that sources of tension in European countries contributed to this outbreak of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, which lasted, the conflict was started in 1754 in North America and ended in 1763 in Europe. So the continental campaigns in northeastern North America, the British and French military strategists focused largely on establishing control of and around these inland waterways, including the eastern Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, and Lakes George and Champlain. So to simplify the first few years of the war, the French maintained a very strong foothold in this region up until late 1758. And up until this point, British forces had led numerous unsuccessful campaigns against the French fortifications here. And it was only after the successful siege of Louisbourg that things began to change. General Jeffrey Amherst, the commander-in-chief of all British forces in North America, he devised a plan for a three-pronged attack against New France in 1759. And control over Lake Champlain was vital to his plan and what he saw as the future for the British colonies. After a series of failed attempts to take Fort Ticonderoga at the southern end of Lake Champlain, British forces finally pushed through, or rather the French abandoned their southern forts and retreated north to reconsolidate. It was in 1759 where Amherst called upon Royal Navy Captain Joshua Loring to construct a brig to counter the French vessels on the lake. In the small bay 400 meters southeast of Fort Ticonderoga, Loring established what is later referred to as the King's Shipyard to build and fit this first vessel. And after hearing reports that the French were adding more sloops, more vessels to their fleet, Amherst ordered another vessel to be built, a radeau, ligonier. And a radeau is just like a flat-bottomed vessel. This is essentially a glorified floating gun battery. And it was used it wasn't the most efficient sailor, but it still carried quite a punch with carrying 6 24-pounders on board. This second vessel, was built at Crown Point, north of Ticonderoga, by a Major Thomas Ord. And continued reports of growing French naval presence caused Amherst to order yet another vessel, this time a sloop. And there were many complications in building this small British flotilla, like rainstorms and repeated failures of the sawmill equipment, which caused major delays. Still, though, the fleet was built in an extraordinarily short period of time, in less than 2 months collectively. The 100-foot-long brig Duke of Cumberland was built in 20 days total, and the 78-foot-long sloop Boscawen was built in 22 days. Loring gave command of the sloop to Lieutenant Alexander Grant, while he took command of the larger brig. And the image on the right is actually from one of only 2 contemporary depictions of Boscawen and Duke of Cumberland, which were painted by Thomas Davies. He was an officer in the Royal Army. And this is one of them, actually the better quality, that shows the vessels in more detail. As you can see on the right-hand side of the painting, Boscawen and Duke of Cumberland moored in their locations there, and actually towards the center of the screen you can see the radeau, ligonier. This is a depiction of Crown Point before their 1759 campaign. And that campaign, the 1759 campaign, was extremely brief. It only lasted from around October 11th to the 19th. And Amherst ultimately called off this campaign after Quebec surrenders. This is what's depicted here in this image. And most of the action on Lake Champlain consisted of the British flotilla, or really just Duke of Cumberland and Boscawen, giving chase to French vessels. And the French actually ended up scuttling their 3 sloops in a small bay, which were eventually later salvaged by Lieutenant Grant and incorporated into the British naval force on the lake. So after this short campaign, the now expanded flotilla wintered over at the lake's southern fortifications, Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point. So after the French surrendered at Quebec in 1759, the French troops retreated to Montreal, where they were surrounded again. The British set their sights on this final fortification the following year, closing in from those three directions. Boscawen and the other British vessels returned to service in 1760 as transports for troops and supplies, but Alexander Grant, now in command of the Lake Champlain fleet, aided in an amphibious assault led by the notorious Major Robert Rogers on Ile Lanneau at the northern end of the lake. Ultimately, the French at Montreal agreed to a complete surrender in September 1760. The flotilla returned to Ticonderoga and remained there throughout the end of the war in Europe. There is one vessel that was used after the war, one of the small captured ex-French sloops, but textual evidence is pretty sparse for the upkeep and status of the vessels, all of the vessels after the war. And one letter suggests that Boscawen had already sank by 1763. The King's Shipyard wharf was used during the Revolutionary War as part of the western side of a great bridge, which connected the east and western shores and their associated fortifications, Fort Ticonderoga on the west and Mount Independence on the east. And this map is actually one of the final 18th century depictions of the vessels at this King's Shipyard. You can see them underneath kind of the dock structure, or at least depicted underneath the floating bridge. So now we jump ahead in time to the 1980s. And it was in 1983 when Kevin Chrisman and Arthur Cohen conducted a survey of the area in the hopes of finding the remains of the Revolutionary War era bridge. In addition to finding the western end of the bridge in the King's Shipyard, they found the remains of several Seven Years' War vessels. And over the next 2 years, the team decided to focus on one of those vessels, the largest of the three. The team recovered over 5,000 artifacts and recorded hull timbers, and they split this artifact collection up into 4 major categories, which were the subjects of master's theses here at Texas A&M University. These theses were on armament and weapons, personal items in shipboard life, tools, and rigging. The artifacts, hull dimensions, and location of the site allowed the team to identify the wreck as the sloop Boscawen. And here are some of the artifacts recovered from the site. And so, some of the armament was very much outdated, such as the French mortar bomb on the bottom left, which is dated to the early 1700s and likely was transported from New France after the war. Other items like shoes and tools, which were more likely used by British soldiers and sailors, were heavily used and essentially scrap at the time of sinking. The faunal and botanical remains on board suggest that the crew foraged for the food and to supplement their military rations. And while each of the theses examines separate artifact assemblages from Boscawen, they all come to a similar conclusion that North America, especially the interior fortifications, were likely used by both the British and French as kind of like a dumping ground for old military supplies and may not have been as much of a priority as the more urban locations. And then we come to the rigging artifacts as well. And yes, we do see a similar trend of undersupplying, or at least a lack of material availability. There was a cleat, rope, parceling, peril beads, deadeyes, and blocks, and even a mast cap, which was extremely useful, especially when paired with the mast step. So using these artifacts in some interpretations detailed in the master's theses, as well as contemporary images of colonial sloops like from the sloops depicted in journals of Ashley Bowen, or this pamphlet that depicts a Lake George sloop. Using those and some textual evidence that I found in the Clements Library up in Michigan that stated some information about the naval stores at Ticonderoga after the war. I used all of these things to generate a hypothetical reconstruction of Boscawen's rig. So Boscawen had a basic sloop rig consisting of only fore and aft sails, like a main, fore, and a jib, which allowed it to sail quite close to the wind. This would have been especially useful on Lake Champlain as it's a fairly narrow lake, and also the prevailing winds in the Champlain Valley typically blow out of the north or south, depending on the season. Additionally, this rig, without a square topsail, was much easier for inexperienced crew members to sail, as each of the sails could be manipulated from the deck. And I suspect that the height of the mainmast, it being fairly squat, reflects a shortage of rigging components available to looring. So now we come to the hull remains of Boscawen. The hull remains in the King Shipyard were around 70 feet long and 23 feet wide, and most of the timbers were fashioned out of white oak. Timber components were fastened together with iron bolts, spikes, and trunnels, which are just essentially wooden dowels that are used as fasteners. And since I was unable to re-excavate Boscawen, which was my plan from the get-go, this was due to roadblocks put in place by the British Ministry of Defense. My research in hull construction is based on the notes from the 1984 and 1985 excavations. There are some gaps in the hull data, which would have been easily addressed during a redocumentation of the hull, but overall I'm happy with the results of the research and I'm confident in the reconstruction using these existing notes. The keel, stem, and stern assemblies were difficult to access for recording in their entirety, but what the team was able to record shows how simple and minimalistic the components were in their construction. The most interesting feature of the stern assembly is the keelson. It stops before the final two square frames and deadwood, and the stern knee, which is quite strange as it would reduce the strength of the hull at this end. This was either likely caused by a lack of timber availability or a miscalculation by the shipwright. And to examine frame curvature, the archaeological team cut away portions of the ceiling planking in 5 locations along the port side of the hull, focusing on areas of suspected mold frames that would dictate the shape of the hull. And so they recorded the ceiling, the outer hull planking, and widths and thicknesses, the molded and sided dimensions of the framing components, and the curvature of those frames on their outboard faces. The dimensions and spacing of the floors, the floors are the framing components that kind of span the center line. The spacing is quite irregular, a possible byproduct of the hasty construction process. However, the floors are spaced on average 26-ish inches apart on their centers. And the more the floors molded and sided dimensions, their kind of thicknesses and widths, averaged around 10 inches square along the center line. There's also evidence of carpenters not finishing or square cutting Boscawen's floors, leaving a rounded log surface, or what we call a waney edge, and even sometimes bark on these timbers. This was done likely to save time during construction. Boscawen had a total of 6 mold frames, or kind of guide frames, in the hull. These frames were installed every 4th frame and were used to help dictate that shape of the hull. Of interest is that none of these mold frames were actually bolted down to the keel or keelson. The regular square frames were fully disarticulated, and their components were separated from one another, as seen in this image. The archaeological evidence suggests a few possible construction sequences because of this. And the most probable sequence is being that after the keel, stem, and stern were laid down, all of the floors were installed. The initial strakes or the planks were then attached to the floors up to their heads. And following this, the next level of framing components were added. So those would be the first futtocks, and they were secured only to the hull planking. More planks would be added up to the first futtock heads, and this alternating pattern would continue up the sides. So the framing components, then planking, framing components, and then more planking. Boscawen had 2 orlop half decks. These are the kind of the lowest deck in the hull, one in the bow and one in the stern. And these were installed right above the keelson, so there wasn't really much space below them to store anything other than ballast. But these were installed, I've reconstructed them there because 5 to 7 orlop deck beams were recorded on Boscawen at these locations. And these decks would have been especially useful at the curved and narrowing ends of the vessel. And here is the midship frame reconstruction. This shows kind of how flat it is at the midship section, where they wouldn't necessarily need one of these orlop decks. And so using those frame constructions, the frame sections and other hull features and dimensions, I was able to generate a hypothetical set of lines for Boscawen. And you can see that Boscawen is a fairly tub-like vessel. It's very stout. And this is a very typical shape for a military transport, especially one serving on an inland lake environment. The next vessel I reconstructed was Duke of Cumberland, its kind of sister vessel. But the question is, where is it? And to answer this question, we have to go kind of back in time to the early 20th century, specifically 1909. So Duke of Cumberland, among a number of other vessels from Lake Champlain and George, was raised during the early 20th century. There were many motivations for raising a shipwreck back then, but in the case of Duke of Cumberland, it was raised and put on display as part of kind of a tercentenary celebration of the lake's discovery, quote unquote, in 1609 by Samuel de Champlain. Unfortunately, not only was the vessel misidentified at the time, but it was also left to decay since there was no kind of established methods of conservation at that time. All that is left of Duke of Cumberland is a small collection of artifacts, photographs, and Warren Harding's chair, funny enough. It was made from this framing component here. It still exists, I think, at their family home. So really all we have left of the hull itself are these photographs, and I wanted to make sure we used every source of detail to compare it to Boscawen, so I identified certain hull features in the photographs, like the stem construction, certain framing patterns, and other methods of construction using like those mold frames or make frames. I revisited the site to find anything to scale it to, like these foundation blocks, the kind of pedestals that they put the vessel on top of. So those still existed, so I was able to measure those and hopefully tried to scale them to the images, and ultimately created a site plan there as well. But what really produced the best results was from photogrammetry, specifically a new way that I was able to create to apply photogrammetric techniques to historical photographs, specifically for shipwrecks. Now I won't get into the kind of the weeds on the exact process because it's a bit complicated and drawn out, but it essentially is manually matching common points on the hull that are visible in multiple surviving photographs. The computer then kind of calculates these points based on a variety of other factors and settings, and produces a cloud of these points in 3D space. And these points can be connected to highlight certain features, and this is where you start to really see the vessel kind of come back to life. So using the flattened 2D images, I was able to create a hypothetical set of hull lines for Duke of Cumberland as well, something that we could actually compare to Boscawen, and actually use in some places to fill in some gaps here and there. So what I found out was that through comparisons with Boscawen, the brig and sloop are unsurprisingly similar, since they were obviously built by the same shipwright and carpenters within 2 months of one another at the same site. So their scantlings and hull shapes, besides the difference in length between the two vessels, are nearly identical, which I argue in my dissertation is no mistake. This would have saved considerable time to build Boscawen, since they were using things like molds and other ways to reduce time during the timber cutting process. The way I think of Boscawen is that they built essentially a second Duke of Cumberland, just without 20 feet in the middle of it. And so now, we're returning to the King Shipyard site and the most recent archaeological work completed there. And so in February of 2019, I led a through ice geophysical survey at the site, which was funded by INA. And this was a very important project, not only because we were using things like a ground penetrating radar to identify known targets, like the three vessels in the wharf pylons discovered in the 1980s, but we were also there to hopefully identify and locate some additional targets. We also used a magnetometer and a vertical gradiometer setup to map the magnetic features on the lake bed as well. And this was done in partnership with the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, the Fort Ticonderoga Museum, and the Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And here's the data from here are the data from the magnetometer readings. And this project was extremely useful, like I said, not only to locate and identify those targets, but also to refine the geophysics methodologies, because we were using terrestrial equipment to survey shipwreck sites on the ice. And so this hasn't really been done too many times. And so we were there to kind of refine that methodology that was created by Ben Ford, who's a former student in the nautical archaeology program here, and now he works at Indiana University of Pennsylvania with his colleagues. We returned to that same site the following summer for an in-water survey that was also funded by INA. This site was just as challenging to excavate as it was back in the 1980s. The visibility here on a good day was around maybe 1 foot, maybe 2 if you're lucky. But as soon as you start working, it immediately goes to 0. So most of the dives were spent feeling the wreck rather than seeing it. And so also as you can see, when the water gets warmer, there's much more weed growth, like this invasive milfoil that gets caught on everything and makes it very hard to survey the site efficiently. But we were still managing to get a lot of work done. Since we could not re-excavate Boscawen here, the kind of largest vessel there, we focused most of our attention on 2 of the other vessels in the King Shipyard site, so KS-1 and KS-2. We recovered a number of artifacts from these vessels, which are nearly finishing their conservation treatments out at the Conservation Research Laboratory here at Texas A&M University. And our initial comparisons to Boscawen's artifact assemblages are already quite enlightening. We're seeing many of the same types of artifacts and evidence for hunting and foraging to supplement rations as well. And we did find some unusual faunal evidence. This is one of the many that we have here. This is actually a horse bone with butchering marks on them. This was on board the larger of the 2 vessels, KS-1. So additional research is currently underway right now as to comparing these assemblages, but also trying to find some more information about them. And yes, this is a 26th Regiment button, which is from the Revolutionary War, not from the 7 Years' War, but maybe I'll answer questions about that after the presentation. We also had some intrusions, or at least material that we weren't necessarily looking for. So there was a lot of material from Fort Ticonderoga's 19th century steamboat dock. In fact, the coke or the clinker, this is spent coal from the steamboats that was like burnt and then essentially it's just thrown overboard. It really gave us a lot of issues because it has quite a strong magnetic signature. So as you can see in the southwest portion of the geophysical survey here, this portion, where the KS-1 would have been located right here, we sort of see something, but it's kind of obscured by a lot of this magnetometer data. We can see that there was 2 large clinker piles that were messing with the gradiometer data. And so this is something that we weren't expecting. We thought that a lot of the clinker or spent coal would have been farther south, but it seems to have blown kind of on top of our site. So we surveyed the KS-2 vessel, which is a flat bottom vessel. We think it's either a small radeau or a bateau, which is another unique small flat bottom vessel that was used as kind of like a workhorse vessel in the inland waterways here. But this vessel was largely broken up, with it being very close to the shore with kind of the ice move every year. But we were still able to create a site plan of it. We did find a rather unusual crenellated timber. We believe it's some sort of longitudinal timber like a keelson or even possibly like a chine log, but it lacks fasteners, so it would have been kind of rather loose in a way in the hull. So there's still additional research that needs to be done on this vessel particularly. We focused most of our efforts on KS-1, the possible sloop. And so we are seeing some actually similarities between KS-1 and 2, especially in their construction, mainly their framing and fastening components. So KS-1 and KS-2 could potentially be French-built vessels that were captured by the British. Though possibly, at least KS-1 could be possibly one of those 3 French sloops that was captured in that first year of the campaign. So if so, these would be some of the oldest colonial-built French sailing vessels ever to be excavated in North America. Definitely would be the oldest vessels on Lake Champlain. This also creates a unique opportunity for us to see how these vessels were built compared to British-built colonial vessels like Boscawen. The reason why these could potentially be French-built are the use of double-clenched iron nails, and there are different framing scantlings and patterns when we compare them to the British construction on the lake, like Duke of Cumberland and Boscawen. We recorded the stem and stern of KS1, and the most striking feature, at least for the stern, is the stern assembly is that it has a very, very vertical stern post, nearly 90 degrees. This could be how the vessel is resting in the water, so additional excavation needs to occur here, but still, even if it was canted all the way forward, this is still quite a very vertical stern post for the time, especially for this kind of vessel that we're thinking it is. KS1 had about 32 to 34 frame pairs that were spaced roughly 16 to 17 inches apart on their centers. And here is that framing comparison that I keep mentioning. So every frame in KS1 and KS2 was fully articulated and laterally fastened, so using those double clenched bolts. And so if you remember back to Boscawen, every fourth frame was a made frame, and in between those frames were disarticulated framing components that were only attached to the hull planking. This is not the case with KS1 and KS2. And this is strikingly different. On top of that, we can see that it has considerably less robust framing than when we compare them to British vessels, or at least the British-built vessels around this region. Granted, Boscawen and Duke of Cumberland were considerably much larger vessels, but even the Tubble sloop, which is another vessel I reconstructed using the historical photogrammetry, it was raised from Lake George in 1903. It's about the same size as KS1, but it still has considerably larger framing. So still, the purpose of all of this work is to ultimately put Boscawen and the other vessels of this region in context with those outside of the Lake Champlain Valley. So in my dissertation, I examined the framing of 12 vessels built during the mid and late 18th century in northeastern North America. And I consider how certain aspects of shipbuilding in this region, like the disarticulated framing components, may be in fact more than just mere shipbuilding shortcuts. Rather, these techniques may actually represent foundational methods of ship construction significant to this region. I also found some trends, and probably the most noticeable trend is the similar average frame spacing, at least in the British-built vessels. I was seeing a trend of about 22 inches apart on their centers for the framing components. This demonstrates, again, a possibility of a common or standard practice in spacing of floors for vessels built in this region. In addition to this, we're currently examining and comparing the artifact assemblages of Boscawen and the new KS1 vessel, that possible French sloop, and other vessels in this region and time period. The KS1 vessel is shedding new light and reinforcing previous interpretations on some of the fascinating elements of shipboard life and organization at this time. And continued work at the KS1 site is imperative. We could learn so much new information about the construction of early colonial French sailing vessels in North America, and it can serve as a fantastic counterpoint to Boscawen and the other British-built vessels that have been we have been generating information on. I hope that a full excavation of the site will be possible in the coming years. And so I wanted to thank these people listed here for their contributions in support of my research, my museum partners in the fieldwork, the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum and Fort Ticonderoga Museum, some of the Texas A&M organizations here like CMAC and the CRL. And finally, a huge thanks needs to go to INA for the logistical and financial supports for my 2 field projects. And without their help, this research would not have been possible. So, and also, again, thank you all for coming today, and thank you, INA, for organizing this webinar series. And I look forward to seeing other speakers in the future. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. It was a great talk and extremely interesting.
Thank you.
So now I will say that if anybody would like to ask any question to Dan, please feel free to ask your questions. I mean, I think you can you can ask directly if you want. Do we have any questions? Excuse me, just a second.
I also apologize. I think my apartment complex is mowing right outside my apartment right now. So.
Don't worry, we are. Let me see. I'm going to unmute everybody.
I think Warren's got a question, looks like.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you. Hey, Dan, where were you about 30 years ago? I had to, your new photogrammetric technique would have been really helpful. I had to do that all by hand. It took a long time. So my hat's off to you. That was good. I like that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we have another question. I mean, as related to what you mentioned about the button that you found during the excavation, and Justin Consolvo is asking if could you explain the presence of the regimental button in the site?
Yeah. So there's even on Boscawen before even KS1, there was a number of intrusive artifacts on Boscawen, things that were from later on in the 18th century. I think one of them was like a powder flask was like particularly stands out in my mind as one of those. This button, because of the situation of the site itself with that Revolutionary War bridge, the Great Bridge, we believe, or we know, especially from some of these surveys happening on the eastern side, on the Vermont side, they were throwing a ton of trash overboard off the bridge itself during a lot of the retreats that were happening around the bridge, around these fortifications. And so we believe that this button is from either someone's jacket that was thrown overboard or just got caught on something and just slipped off over on top of the wreck, because everything else is kind of pointing to a mid-century identification. But again, more analysis. Like I would love to get back there to do a full excavation to really see if there's anything else, or if this is an actual vessel from a later period than what we're originally interpreting. But everything else in the artifact assemblage is pointing to mid-18th century as opposed to the late. But that 26 regiment button is kind of like an interesting find, because it is the British regiment that was captured at Fort Ticonderoga when Ethan Allen captures the fort and becomes America's first fort. So in the Revolutionary War. But
We have another question. Mark is asking how big were the crews on these vessels?
So on Boscawen, it was about 110 or so, and that was for a 78-foot-long vessel with really only one main deck, and you have a lot of storage and cargo down below. There's not a lot of room for these folks. And obviously, it's an inland waterway, so you can still, you're still connected very much to the fortifications on the lake, but still, it would have been very cramped. Duke of Cumberland had slightly more than that, but we're unsure as to how many would have been serving on board the smaller KS1, that kind of ex-French sloop. We're unsure as to that, because it wasn't really used initially in those initial campaigns. It was just kind of used maybe as a transport or just kind of an entourage for Boscawen and Duke of Cumberland.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Of
Dave,
course.
you're being very modest about the challenges that you faced in the field and planning, going, to great lengths, as I think most people here can appreciate, what's involved in planning a fieldwork season. And then sadly, you really didn't get to do what you set out to do. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the dialogue that you had with the British ministry, and what was their rationale? Why, what did they object to, and why, and how did that all pan out?
Yeah, so for a long, I had been applying for permits and things. Like the state of New York was great about this project. The local site, Fort Ticonderoga, they were fantastic. And the EPA, everyone was kind of on board with this project, but it still had to kind of go through that final loop, or that final loophole, or the hoop to jump through, which is the Sunken Military Craft Act. And because Boscawen is a British vessel which hadn't been captured in battle, it belonged technically still to the British. And so I had to get permission from them, the British Ministry of Defense, who owns the vessel. And it was about an 8 to 9 month process of just emailing back and forth, sending. They didn't have any research designs that or templates that they wanted me to submit it to, so I had to kind of create my own research design for them and send it off to them. And it basically was just like a waiting game for a lot of these months. I wouldn't hear back from them for probably about a month at a time, and I just have to keep bugging them because I was seeing my summer deadline coming quicker. So I kept bugging them, and they just, every time I would email them, it was some new committee that needed to be involved or some new organization that needed to sign off on it. And ultimately, we got in touch with INA's legal counsel, and they had worked with the British Ministry of Defense before on some projects. And so I asked kind of like their advice on this whole process, and basically what I was told is that this was largely just a stalling tactic or a stalemate that they had kind of enacted to maintain like no decision for this project. They did, and really the only answers that I could get directly from the British Ministry of Defense was that they wanted to maintain the same status for all of the vessels under their purview, which would be we're holding back on a lot of the in-water activities on these sites and only examining things that have already been excavated and artifact collections and things. I didn't like that answer. So I kind of had to switch, right? Because right at the field season time, I was awarded a discovery grant from INA for $25,000 for the initial project was to re-excavate Boscawen and then do some like auxiliary surveying around it on those other vessels. And so when that wasn't looking like that was going to be possible, I returned to those other vessels and I said, okay, we're going to, I had to give money back because it wasn't going to be a full-scale operation like we had originally planned. And so we did a smaller survey of those external vessels. Technically, while we have an idea of the identity of those vessels, them being the ex-French sloops and technically captured by the British. So if they are those vessels, they're technically owned by the British, but because we don't have a good identity on these vessels, they still can't fall 100% under the purview of the British Ministry of Defense. So that's why we were able to still work on those sites, because we needed to identify them first. I still don't think we have enough evidence to fully identify them as such, but future field work would hopefully reveal that. It was just maddening kind of getting roadblocked the entire time for like 9 months. It was like hundreds of emails with these people. And it largely, the biggest thing was that the biggest reason cited by the MOD was UNESCO, which is also fascinating because UNESCO convention states that they prefer in situ analysis and non-disturbance for their survey and archaeological work. Well, that's great. There's a lot of things that impact, like in situ preservation is great and all, but it doesn't also answer the question of there's bacterial erosion, there's natural degradation that's occurring on these sites, and if we don't get to them, how are we ever going to find out what's there? And at the same time, the other question in the back of my mind was that the UK hasn't ratified UNESCO. So they haven't, I don't think they're all fully jumped on board yet either. So, which is another interesting aspect to their arguments. I'm hoping that in the future, I can have some face-to-face conversations with them after COVID. I can have some face-to-face conversations with them and explain to them about the situation with Boscawen, especially since it's already been excavated for 2 field seasons. All of the artifacts have been excavated and conserved, but they still didn't want me to go back to the site. So hopefully cooler heads will prevail and more logical reasons can be articulated to me.
You were very cool-headed. You really kept it together. It's so fascinating to me that preservation has become almost a foil for just a total lack of urgency. I mean, what would have been their obligation? I mean, had you raised artifacts, you would have conserved them. Would they have assumed ownership of those artifacts?
Technically, they would fall under the same guidelines as everything that Boscawen had already done. So Boscawen was excavated before the Sunken Military Craft Act. So technically, those artifacts are still retroactively under that. And so they're owned by the British Ministry of Defense, but they're on loan to the state of New York, which is then on loan again to Fort Ticonderoga Museum. So the same thing would have occurred. So they really didn't have much of a stake in this. They obviously weren't sending any of their archaeologists or scholars to come study this or monitor the site, to even evaluate the conditions at the site. So the whole project was like funded. Conservation would have been taken care of. In situ preservation after the project would have been taken care of. And even there was some, I had the US Navy as a liaison for this whole experience as well, for most of it. And they were fully prepared to take stewardship of the site on behalf of the MOD, the British Ministry of Defense. And they were fully expecting that to happen. But again, the MOD just didn't bite and didn't want to make any decision. They just kind of left it.
Well, I hope you keep after them and keep up the good work and don't give up.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Oh, I think Charles.
Yes.
Charles
Yes,
is.
Charles, just let's see. It needs to be unmuted. Charles,
I think you can do that for him, Jose.
yeah, is.
I thought I was unmuted. No.
Okay.
Anyway, first, thank you again. Wonderful presentation.
Thank
Say good afternoon to Debbie Carlson. I haven't seen her in years. I have a
Great, Charles. Good to see you.
off-the-wall question.
Sure.
My experience is with the Royal Navy, not with the Royal Army. Why are you calling this vessel a sloop?
So yeah, so this vessel is a sloop just based on its previous archival evidence. So you're referencing KS1, the small potential French.
No, the Boscawen.
Boscawen, sure. So Boscawen, we know it had only one mast, and so really we're just classifying it as a sloop because of its single-masted rigging.
Well, my understanding, the British Navy would never accept that. Is the vessel under the captain? The captain of the sloop is a commander. If a commander is aboard, it's a sloop, whether it's a brig or a single-masted or a double-masted, whatever. And I didn't understand why you called it a sloop.
Sure, and so oftentimes the smaller vessels, even like the brig Duke of Cumberland, that was considered at that time to be under kind of an umbrella classification of sloop of war. That was like the full title is sloop of war. And but just for their individual classifications based on their rigging alone, they would be classified technically as by their rig, not necessarily how many guns they had or how many cannons they had on board or crew they had, or even who was command of the vessel. So they just largely started to adopt a classification system during the 18th and early 19th century.
Okay, I'll live with it. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Anybody would like to?
I have a quick one. This is Bill Cole. We have heard of zebra mussel problems on many of the Lake Champlain sites. Is there one at this site?
So this site is interesting. There's zebra mussels everywhere up there, and they do impact most of the submerged cultural heritage in the lake. This site is different in some way, largely because it's at the southern end of the lake. It's the siltier part of the lake, and we're actually right around the corner from the site is La Chute River, which dumps a ton of silt out into the lake, and then it all flows north, and that flows right over top of our site. So pretty much all of the site, except for some maybe six inches to maybe a foot above the sediment line, There's some frame tips that are sticking out, and the like stem and stern post are sticking out a little bit, but everything else underneath it is all submerged under the sediment. So they're protected largely by the sediment. However, anything that's above it is kind of fair game for those little critters. And so they're kind of all over everything else, but everything below that sediment line is really well preserved here at the site.
Any other questions?
Well, yeah, could I ask one more?
Sure.
Again, the relationship with the Royal Navy and this Navy, which I have a hard time with. When you did all the, especially with regard to the life on board the Boscawen from your artifacts, and especially the consumables, is there any relationship at all between what was really sort of written in concrete for a British sailor versus what these sailors were getting as rations?
So from what I understand, my dissertation research didn't necessarily focus as much on the foodstuffs or the provisioning side of things, but I did do some side research into it. So the interesting thing about these vessels, or at least Duke of Cumberland, Boscawen, and Ligonier, those vessels and some of these smaller craft as well, they were actually built under the purview of the Army. And so they weren't necessarily Royal Navy vessels. They were just military vessels. Still, they had a Royal Navy captain come in and kind of organize the building and operation of those vessels. But for the rationing side of things, they still followed some of the guidelines. Like there was some standardization to how much beef and how much biscuit they could have in a given week. But largely, I don't think they had enough in this area, and so that provisioning in these regions, especially this interior side of the in the mid-18th century at least, provisioning was kind of on a down low, or on the low scale of things. So that's why they had to kind of provision with those gourds or the other kind of foraging for nuts and seeds and berries and things, but also hunting as well for deer and pig, wild boar.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other question? Well, then I would like to thank you, Dr. Dan Bishop, for such an interesting and great presentation, great research, by the way, I mean, amazing. And also all the participants for attending the first webinar of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology in 2021. I hope to see you again in the next meeting that will be posted online. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Debbie. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks to all who attended. This was a great first effort, maybe a little bit later than we should have gotten started, but better late than never.
That's great.